Hey folks, welcome back to History and Politics Chat on Thursdays at 4 o'clock. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. All right, so let's get to some of your questions today about what's going on. And again, just a reminder here, we have this huge election coming up in 2 months. And I suspect you are all feeling what I am, which is overload. You know, the news is constant. And one of the things that I did today was I went through, I can't tell you how many sets of tabs I keep open. I know it's bad for my computer, but I do it anyway. And I don't always have the space to put them in the letters. And I think, oh, I'm going to come back to that story. And I was looking over some of them today as I was closing tabs, and some of them are 3 to 4 days old, and already those stories are gone. I mean, like gone to the point that I'm looking at it going, I don't remember this, and it seemed very big on the day that it happened. So, breathe. These 2 months are going to go, and try not to let it overwhelm you. At least that's what I keep telling myself. So anyway, a bunch of you had questions about, larger questions really this week, about democracy and about politics and about representation and why we are where we are. And I'll go ahead and try and take them on in some kind of order. So the first one actually came from last week, and it was somebody wrote and asked, why is democracy a good system? I mean, because we're looking at it right now, and it looks kind of torn up in a lot of ways. And there was an article that was published today, I think, in the New Yorker, as I recall, that talked about how American democracy has always really been factionalized, and it's always been a dream more than a reality, and that we're going to continue to break down, and et cetera, et cetera. And is democracy a good system? Well, I believe in democracy, and I believe in democracy with almost a religious faith, because I believe fundamentally in the principle of human self-determination, that we should all have a right to decide how we're going to live our lives, so long as, of course, we don't intrude on the lives of others, except to the degree that we have to get along as a society. And to that end, what system of government offers the greatest chance of people being able to determine their own government, the government under which we live? To me, that's democracy. That's the idea that everyone, with caveats, of course, you're not going to, I certainly would not be in line for letting a 3-year-old vote, but we always put some boundaries around who gets to vote. That everybody has a say in his or her society and his or her government. And so I believe that offers far more ability for the individual to become what she or he should be than any other system. That being said, democracy is very messy. That somebody once said that it's the worst form of government except for all the others. It's messy. We don't move in a good direction. It takes a long time to get people turned around. It gets us into all kinds of trouble. But what it doesn't do is, if you have an autocracy or a government that creates hierarchies among among people in a society, that always leaves the room for extraordinary abuses. And democracy theoretically should prevent those abuses, because if in fact you consider everybody to be equal and equal before the law, that should mean that we check and balance each other. So I'm a big believer in democracy, and I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to keep on beating that horse because it's a long, bigger topic. But yeah, I'm wedded to democracy, and I'll tell you a bit more over the course of the day about why and how that plays out. So another question that somebody asked is, could I lay to rest that question about what is the difference between a democracy and a republic? Because so often when you say, oh, an American democracy, there's always someone in the back of the room going, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And it drives people like me insane, because it's really, as another political scientist says, it's really rather like saying, I don't have a dog, I have a golden retriever. When we talk about a democracy, what we are talking about is a system of government in which people get to choose, but through election, their leaders. Now, traditionally, a true democracy was a direct election. That is, you directly participated in your government. And obviously, we have too many people for that. So we have a republic in which we elect our leaders to make those rules for us. But at the end of the day, we're still a dog. We still are electing our representatives as opposed to having them imposed on us as we would in a monarchy, for example, or as we would in any kind of a dictatorship. So it's kind of a flavor thing. And my answer to that is always, why does it make a difference to you to distinguish between a democracy and a republic? Because the only way that you can say that they are different is that in one people elect their leaders. Well, does that mean somehow that those leaders should not be responsible to the people who elected them? Well, in fact, there are times in America in which that's exactly what leaders have said. So, for example, in 1858, there's a famous speech in front of the Senate by a man named James Henry Hammond. And if you know my work, you know I go back to the speech a lot. And Hammond is standing up in the Senate, and he's a toad. I mean, he's awful. I don't have time. Just take my word for it. You don't like James Henry Hammond. But anyway, James Henry Hammond gets up and he's trying to make an argument in the Senate about why the Senate should not and the government should not do what the vast majority of Americans want it to do. And why they should not have to do that, even though that's the popular thing. And what he says is, he has a number of reasons for that. First of all, he says that because of the way the founders wrote the Constitution, it simply can't do what people want it to do, and we have to live by this document as it was written in the 1700s. Of course, it's serving his interest to do that. But he also goes on to say, listen, just because you're talking about democracy doesn't actually mean that people should get to have a say in their government. All it means is they should get to have a say in who they pick to run their government, so that as long as they pick people like me, I can do whatever I want. And I guess that's an argument to be made, but to me that really doesn't sound like democracy. That sounds much more like, I don't know what it sounds like. But so you could make an argument, I suppose, that there's a difference between a republic and a democracy, in that we simply, in a republic, get to choose our leaders to impose whatever they want on us. I think that if you ask somebody if that's what they are saying when they say we're not a democracy, we're a republic, they would not be likely to say that yes, indeed, they think our leaders should do what we don't want them to do. It's usually a way to try and change the subject, as near as I can tell. So that's the difference between a democracy and a republic. For all intents and purposes at this moment, it's a distinction with, I don't want to say it's a distinction without a difference, because of course there's a difference, but both are dogs, if you will. One's a golden retriever and one's I don't want to say a Rottweiler, because some people have negative connotations with that. One's a black lab. So there you go, two different flavors of the same animal. All right, so this brings up another question though. And I'm happy to see that a couple of questions are flying by right now about the Electoral College. All right, so this brings up another question, and that is, what the heck is going on right now? So we have had two Republican presidents recently who have lost the popular vote by a lot, and they've gone ahead to win the White House legally. So what's up with that? And I want to start by saying, first of all, that that's a problem. That's a big problem, because one of the ways that a democracy works is that people believe that their leaders have been popularly elected. That is, maybe you don't like whoever is in office, but you were on the losing team. And sometimes people get offended because I compare this to a soccer game or to a baseball game or something. Politics is not a game because our lives depend on it. But the concept is not unlike it. The concept of politics is not unlike a game. That is, so long as the field is held level, you want your people to be on your team to be as good as they possibly can be, and you're going to run the best people you can run. But if the other team is better and the refs hold things even, it's okay when you lose, because you know that the game is going to be there to play another day, and you can practice harder, or you can get better people on your team, and maybe the guys on the other side are not going to have such a good year. As long as the playing field stays level, the game is intact. The problem is when one side starts to get an artificial advantage. And what I always compare this to is, if, for example, you're playing soccer, and I'm making this up, of course, I'm absolutely making this up, but if you're playing soccer and one side starts to cheat, And they start to cheat first simply by, quietly illegal moves and things that hurt the other side, but not enough to throw them out of the game, throw the other side out of the game. And the refs stop calling that. And gradually the one side starts to cheat and starts to get away with it. Now they don't have to be as good as the other side. They just have to be working the refs. And pretty soon, over time, the more that they can cheat, the worse that they can get. The stronger and stronger the other side gets, but it doesn't do them any good because they're going to lose against this team that's got, an unfair advantage. And what's crucial to that from a political standpoint is that other side, as it gets weaker, because it is going to get weaker, it doesn't need to have the good players any longer because it's got the refs cheating for them, or they're cheating internally. As they get weaker, they're going to get angrier and angrier and want to go ahead and take over more and more of the other side unfairly, because they don't really have the muscle any longer on their side. And the problem with that is that pretty soon, where their fans are cheering them on, and they might continue to win against the side that is unfairly disadvantaged. But pretty soon, yeah, they're going to win. They're going to take over that other side, but the game's lost. You can't have a game any longer because there aren't those two sides anymore. So this is a real problem for democracy. When you have a side, it does happen occasionally, although in the 4 times it's happened in America, it's always been the Republicans, by the way, who have taken the White House by losing the popular vote. But it does you can see how it would happen occasionally. But if it's going to happen again and again and again, some of those people on the losing side are going to start to say, wait a minute, this game isn't fair any longer. Like, we don't believe in the game any longer. We're not going to live under these rules any longer. We're going to want to take out the system because it doesn't work any longer. And that's how a democracy dies. So this is a really big problem, especially as going forward, it looks more and more like there's going to be a disconnect between the American popular vote and the Electoral College. All right, let me explain what the Electoral College is. And by the way, you see things all the time. You see people saying, well, 25 years out, this is going to happen, or 15 years out, this is going to happen, or whatever. I ignore those with all of my heart because we don't know. You can certainly write an article that says demographic trends suggest, but we don't know. I mean, we just don't know what's going to happen. So, for example, 3 years ago, if you had looked at demographic trends in housing, for example, you would not have taken into consideration COVID-19, which apparently has most young people moving back home with their parents. I mean, who could have seen that? So if you see those things, don't panic when it says, in 15 years, everyone's going to live on a postage stamp in New Jersey or whatever. I made that up. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. And that's kind of the fun of being human, right? We get to choose. So anyway, how did we get into this mess? We got into this mess, and this is really important to remember for a lot of things I'm going to be talking about today, is that when the founders wrote the Constitution, they did not believe in political parties. They were against political parties. And that's going to change really quickly. And I'm going to give you a really quick history here because it matters so much. If you think about the idea of governments, when you have a monarchy, the idea of there being an opposition party is treason, right? You're either for the king or you're against the king. And it's really only in the early 1700s that you begin to see in England, from which most Americans take their cues about politics, that you begin to see the concept of a loyal opposition. The idea that somebody can disagree with the policies that are being put in place usually it's by the king's ministers. They don't take on the king himself, but they're put in place by the king's ministers and still be loyal to the monarchy. That's a really important intellectual concept. The idea that you can disagree with the head of state, disagree with the policies of the head of state, and yet still be in favor of the state. Remember, think about your British history, about which I know almost nothing, but think about it. How many people get into trouble with one monarch or another and end up losing their head over it because you can't be against Queen Elizabeth and want to replace her with her sister and still be loyal to the monarch, right? So this whole idea of having a loyal opposition is really new. And the founders are they actually adhere to a certain set of thinkers that are opposition thinkers in England. So they're willing to think that maybe you can be you can be an opposition believer without being disloyal. But that being the case, if in fact, and bear with me here for a second, intellectually, like logically, if you get rid of the monarch, you should not need a political party because everyone agrees, right? You no longer have the court party doing everything around the king and you. I'm sorry, the people who are on the outs. Instead, everybody's one big happy family now, right? Everything's just ducky. Well, of course, that doesn't happen. And immediately after the revolution, when people are thinking about this, they note immediately that there are going to that you have both the people who are running the country under the Articles of Confederation, and then you have the people who are opposed to that. And that's one of the reasons we get the Constitutional Convention. Well, when they do the Constitutional Convention, they run into the same problem and they think, no, we're going to be fine. We're going to get rid of all that factionalism. And we're going to get, and factionalism is essentially the idea of a political party. And we're going to get rid of all that factionalism. So we're going to write a government that's so cool, that's so good, this machine that can run of itself, as they say. We're not going to need to worry about political parties because we're all going to be in this together. We're going to be these enlightened people who are going to think great thoughts and write great policies, right? But, and I'm totally aside here. I want to point out, when we talk about the founders, we all have this idea that these guys are like 600 years old, sitting around with their white powdered wigs. By the way, George Washington had bright red hair. They're really young men. For the most part, they are very young men who do this. And it's one of the things I always tell my students, the idea that you've got to be 80 to change the world. I really believe 80-year-olds can change the world, but somehow we've gotten this idea in America that if you have an idea and you're 20, that somehow you're too young to have that idea. Well, tell that to Lafayette, right? Because he was, I think, 24 when he took over that's off the top of my head, I might be wrong. He's in his early 20s when he takes over the armies that he marshals during the war. These are young people, and they have these ideas that they can change the world, because that's exactly how you change the world, is through ideas. So anyway, they have this idea that you're not going to need political parties. So they're going to create this system that's going to work on its own. And what they do is they decide that they've got a problem in the colonies, I'm sorry, the new states, because the new 13 states, because it's very hard to communicate across these states. We don't really have many means of communication except by writing letters. We do have newspapers, but newspapers at the time are not what we consider newspapers today. They are not news. They're not breaking news. They're much more sort of sheets of paper about what an educated man needs to know. And, you pass them around by hand, but they're kind of like what happened last month, not what happened yesterday. And if you want to know what's really going on, you do it by talking to people and by exchanging letters. Well, that's really slow, because letters are going to be exchanged according to traveling on horseback along Benjamin Franklin's post roads, for example, which he does under the king. And then later on, of course, you're going to find the prescription for post office roads in the Constitution, because this is how you exchange information. And also by ship. It's always this, and boat. It's always a mistake to forget about water. In our lifetimes, for most of us, water has seemed like a barrier, but that's really a post-World War I, post-World War II idea until we really get interstate highways, which is not going to happen until after World War II. It's much more efficient to travel by water than it is to travel by land. So a lot of stuff is going to travel by water more than it's going to travel by land. And I would love to tell you about genealogical patterns because of that, but I'm going to do you a favor and not. All right, so they got a problem. The founders have a problem, because how is somebody in Massachusetts going to know the great guys from Georgia? They're really not. And how is somebody from New Hampshire going to know who's really terrific in New York? They're really not either, especially if they're not in the seaports. So maybe what you need to do is to guarantee that the people who decide on the leaders of the country are not doing it directly, but rather what you want to do is have your local people elect the thinkers and the well-traveled men. These are all going to be men in this period, that they know. So instead of saying, hey, what do you think about this guy from down here in Georgia or Virginia? Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to ask local people to elect the men of great standing in their communities, and they're all going to come together and they're going to debate who they think are the leading men in line to run the country. And this is what's going to be known as the Electoral College. So when you vote, you literally are electing electors, people who are going to sit around and chat about who are the best guys to run the country. But now here's the next layer. The founders didn't expect that these guys were going to agree. They expected that they were going to have some pretty strong ideas and all that, but they were perfectly prepared for the electors to kick up 2 or 3 top dogs, and then to have the House of Representatives then settle the matter in a different vote, with every state getting 1 vote. So they were perfectly happy to kick it upstairs. But all those provisions really never came into play because the system broke down even before George Washington was out of office. And what happened was that, of course, the Electoral College at first elects George Washington unanimously, because that was kind of the whole point, right? Everyone knew he was going to be the leader of the new country, the president of the new country. But George Washington steps down after 2 terms, which was a really big deal, for him to say, I don't want to have any part of this any longer. And what he does is, one of the reasons he does that is because he's so frustrated with the rise of partisanship, of parties under his watch. And you probably have all heard me riff on how much I hate Thomas Jefferson. Sorry, I'm sure some of you out there love Thomas Jefferson, but one of the reasons I don't like him, top of the list, and it's a long list, is because he repeatedly would say to Washington, oh, horrors, people are starting political parties. Well, he was the one starting the political party. And again, I got no problems with political parties. I'm going to tell you why I think they're actually very important and why I study them. But don't lie. Don't pretend to him you're the clean guy and you're tattling on somebody else when you're the one doing it. Anyway, so even under Washington's term, there develops what is essentially a loyal opposition. And those are people who are concerned that Washington and Hamilton are concentrating power and money too thoroughly in the northern cities, primarily, especially Philadelphia at the time. And they're worried that people like them, people that they call farmers, but what they really mean are plantation owners who enslave other human beings, are going to get cut out of power in the new country. So you get the rise of this group of people, a faction that calls itself the Democratic Republicans. You also may know them as the Jeffersonians. And what they're doing is they're saying, wait, you guys are getting way too strong. You Federalists under Washington are getting way too strong, and you're trying to create a monarchy. It's one of the reasons that Washington steps down. So how does this play out? And I want to pick that up in just a second, too, about why those 2 political parties are important. But to go back to the Electoral College, this matters because after Washington steps down, in that next election, the electors are supposed to vote according to whom they think are the better candidates. So each state gets an elector for each one of its senators and each one of its representatives. So theoretically, they are somewhat balanced in terms of proportion. But the idea is that you could disagree. Electors should vote for whomever they think is the best candidate. But in the election after George Washington steps down, Thomas Jefferson realizes that if the state of Virginia had voted as a voting bloc, he would have won the election. So he sets the wheels in motion to create what is known as a winner-take-all system. That is, instead of having to just sort of appeal to everybody and get as many votes as you can, in each state, the electors will go for whomever the state elects as a whole. I'm not sure I put that clearly, but if Jefferson wins the popular vote in Virginia, even if he gets only 51% of the vote, he will get all the electors instead of getting only 51% of them. And he puts that in place, and in fact, it works. In the election of 1800, we get the election of Thomas Jefferson. And after that, really quickly, a lot of, he does a bunch of other stuff too, by the way, after that election, after the election of 1800, most of the other states follow suit because they recognize that if they don't, their own favorite candidates won't be able to win compared to the ability of winner-take-all states to throw their weight around quite so thoroughly. So the Electoral College is bastardized almost immediately. And it's so upsetting to people like James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution, that he wanted to add an amendment to the Constitution saying that you couldn't do this, that this would, in fact, as he said, lead to exactly where we are now, the ability for somebody to lose the popular vote really dramatically and yet still be elected president under the Electoral College. So when people talk about how we have, we can't get rid of the Electoral College because we have to honor it. My reaction to that is always like, sure, if you want to keep the original Electoral College, get rid of the winner-take-all system, which should return us back to a system that looks much more like the popular vote, or get rid of the system altogether. But don't give us this bastardized system that from the start looked problematic and tell us it was the original, because it's not. And the reason that I care about that is because, again, back to democracy, if people keep getting presidents who are backed by a minority of the population, they will not be, the government will not be able to retain the loyalty of the people, and the democracy will break down. It's a logic problem. You can't have a president who is backed by a minority and expect him or her to continue to have authority in a democracy, because people are going to look at this and say, wait a minute, that's two presidents now we've had from the same party that we don't have, that were not voted in. And if it happens a third time with Trump in 2020, the pattern is not a good one. And especially if the demographic patterns continue to concentrate population in urban areas of certain states, that situation is going to be worse and worse. And that's the other place that there is a problem, and that is that in the 1920s, the House of Representatives capped the number of people who could sit in the House. And that means that that if in fact representation had increased in terms of population, the Electoral College would have expanded dramatically. So California and New York, for example, and Texas would have these huge numbers of representatives, and they would swing the Electoral College. But because we capped that, it means that there's this artificial capping of the power of people in more populous states. And again, that's not democracy. What that says fundamentally is that if you are voting in, say, Wyoming, your vote is worth much more than if you're voting in California, and that's really not okay. So that's how that's what's going on with the Electoral College, and how Trump can lose the popular vote and still win the election. And I've talked a lot about the Electoral College in a bunch of these videos in much more depth if anybody is interested. But that's the I know I get a lot of different people on these, so that's going on with that. So next question. I just saw somebody go by. So somebody's saying, so the large states should take all the power and crush the small states. Of course not. There's all kinds of systems in place to make sure that you don't have a majority crushing a minority, but at the same time, you can't have a minority crushing a majority, which is where we are right now. And these are problems that absolutely can be worked out. All right, so Melina Brune asks, what does campaign money mean, and has it always been like that? And this is a great question. Why do campaigns need money? And that the question of that has changed a lot over time. So campaigns need money, first of all, to get their message out. And in the 19th century, that quite literally meant sending politicians on speaking tours. And that was almost never the president, by the way. The president was supposed to put his behind in the chair and keep his mouth shut, essentially, so that he didn't say anything embarrassing. And that's how you get, for example, in 1880, you get James Garfield's front porch campaign. He wasn't allowed to campaign on his own. He went and sat on his front porch, and people would come through, and there would be news stories about the people who came through, and that was kind of his way of campaigning, including, by the way, the Fisk Jubilee Singers. That was a really big deal to have an African American singing group come and serenade James Garfield, and it made it clear that he was in favor of Black rights, which is really important in 1880. Anyway, so what they would do is they would send other speakers out around, but that cost money. I mean, the train tickets and the hotels and the food. And I mean, to our eyes now, it probably doesn't look really expensive, but they needed to raise cash. So the way that you raised cash in the 19th century was that if you held a government office of any sort at any level, you were expected to kick back a portion of that into the coffers of your party, so they could use that money to get reelected. And it became a scandal in the 1870s and the 1880s, and we're going to get campaign finance reform after that. And I've talked a lot about that in another film, so I won't talk about that now. I'm sorry, another video, so I won't talk about that now. But so campaign money, first of all, essentially means getting out your word out. But that's changed really dramatically. Really in World War I, but especially in World War II and after World War II, when you get the rise of two things. You get the rise, first of all, of air traffic. Airplanes are really expensive compared to trains in the 19th century. So it's going to cost a lot to get your campaign out there. And after the 1940s, 1950s, you're going to actually have your presidential and vice presidential candidates actually out there campaigning. So that means a pretty large entourage, and that's expensive to be out there in the campaign. So first of all, there's moving people around, but then there's another piece of getting out your ideas and getting people to be enthusiastic for your candidate, and that's advertising. And again, in the 19th century, advertising literally was making posters and making pamphlets that you would send around through the mail to make sure everybody had access to these ideas. When you get the rise of television and television advertising, those numbers go through the roof. You know how incredibly expensive it is to have television advertising, and that's going to make things really, really expensive. And campaigns are always going to be hungry for more and more money to get out the message. And I don't know if you've seen the article that I probably will write about tonight, that the Trump campaign is in real trouble because it's basically spent through almost all of its campaign war chest. It's called a war chest, by the way. That's a term of art. Comes from the 19th century. It doesn't mean war or anything. And I should have used its campaign funds. Sorry about that. It's spent almost all of its money, and it's spent its money in a number of ways that seem not very smart to people who study this stuff. But one of the ways is they bought a lot of television advertising early on. During the pandemic, in the early days of the pandemic, and the argument was, well, we have to make sure that people don't see Trump as associated with the bad news of the pandemic, but rather as something good. But now people are looking at it going, you got 2 months left and you have almost no money left. That was maybe not such a good TV purchase, and you may or may not remember that the Trump campaign has recently replaced its campaign manager, Brad Parscale, with somebody else. And the first thing that guy did is he came in and whacked down the budget, and closed offices, and they pulled their advertising out of Arizona, for example. I think it was just last weekend. Too expensive. So television has made things very expensive, but here's the big but that we're seeing now that I find off the charts fascinating. It's really cheap to advertise on Facebook, and it's really cheap to advertise on YouTube. I mean, really cheap, as in, these videos that I'm doing are really costing nothing but my time and the salary I pay to somebody to actually do the uploading for me because I'm too busy to do it. That's unheard of. I mean, this is, Eisenhower couldn't have access to the numbers of people I do just sitting. He had television cameras and producers and cutting and rooms and cameras and film, and, we can just do it now. And that has introduced a number of interesting changes to campaigning. So, for example, I'm watching very closely the Lincoln Project, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about them in a minute. Their initial budget was $10 million, which is I mean, it's big to you and me, or maybe not to you. It's big to me, but that's not very much in terms of rolling out an ad campaign, because they're doing it exclusively, as near as I can tell, through social media and through YouTube. And you know, the reach of that is extraordinary, not least because when you do things through social media channels, people spread them to their own friends. So it's much more effective than sending out, say, you know, ads, putting an ad in the New York Times where people are either going to look at it or they're not. This is much more targeted advertising. So that's another thing that is expensive, is, or has in the past been expensive, is getting out your message. And especially after TV. And now I say this is changing really rapidly, beginning really in 2016 with this idea of having a social media presence. The other thing, though, that has become extremely expensive for the Trump campaign is its legal bills. And this is something that, you know, I've kind of been all over since Donald Trump was inaugurated, and that is that he filed for re-election on Inauguration Day. That has never been done before. And I think there's a number of reasons that he did that. I think it made sense for him to do it, in part because if you remember, and you may not have put these two things together, he's been holding re-election rallies since his first week in office, basically. You know, we've been calling them rallies. They're not speeches. He limits them to, you know, he can give out tickets or sell tickets, and he can limit his audience. Now, if you think of other presidents, all other presidents, they have not behaved that way in office. If you may not remember the George W. Bush administration, but people were really unhappy when he called for protesters to be sort of shoved aside at some of his speeches, but he let them be there. He didn't call them rallies and keep them out. So one, it has permitted him to hold rallies, but two, and here's the kicker, campaign money that is raised from donations can be used to pay legal bills. So we know as of last week, I think, I'm not keeping the recent dates in my head, his campaign, or the Republican National Committee, has spent over $60 million on legal bills for him and for the people in his campaign. And that's expensive. You know, that's money that's not going to be spent on the campaign. That's money that's simply going from, you know, your donor pockets into his lawyers. And that's a piece that I feel like I wish more people understood, because it always makes me sad. I know Trump people who are donating to the Trump campaign, and they're not rolling in money, some of the people I'm thinking about. And it makes me sad to think that they're essentially paying his legal bills so he doesn't have to. And that's, I don't think that's what they think they're doing. I think they think they're supporting some causes they care a lot about. So that's one of the reasons the campaigns have gotten very expensive. But has it always been like this? No. Of course, the numbers have ratcheted up significantly, but what has really opened the floodgates are new legal systems for dumping money into campaigns. And that's the rise of, and I've talked about these in the past, so I'm not going to go over them all right now, but the rise of political action committees, which are organizations that can support a cause that a candidate supports, but not actually support the candidate. So instead of giving money directly to the candidate, you give money to, you know, if I'm supporting, I'm making this up. If I'm supporting Jane Smith for something and she believes in longer school days, I can pour money into the campaign for longer school days without actually pouring money into her. And that means my limits are very different into how I pay. I mean, how much money goes into things. And then there is also the issue of Citizens United. And with Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision really ripped away limits on how much corporations could spend in both supporting candidates and in supporting political action committees. And with that, we get this extraordinary influx of money in the 2016 and 2018 campaigns, especially 2016. And of course, that's really been one of the real issues with the Donald Trump campaign, is where did all that money come from, especially when we know that organizations like the NRA, the National Rifle Association, had scads of money that it had never had before. And I've written about that before. There's a lot of speculation that money came from Russian oligarchs. So but that's speculation. The trail is a little drier than perhaps it ought to be had the House actually been able to enforce any subpoenas. All right, so that's why campaign money matters, and that's why it costs so much to run a campaign. Now, is that going to continue to be the case with the rise of social media? We'll see. We'll see. I think this online stuff is going to change a lot of things in the future. So we're going to have to see. All right, so then a couple of other questions that go into this. Kristen Parker asked, why don't people trust the media? Where did this come from? And who started it and why? Well, that's actually a great question, and it ties into this. It ties into the whole issue of campaigning and of people telling the truth. So let me answer that question and then go into another question from somebody else that links to this. Distrust of the media. I think everybody can always come up with an exception. I'm sure, certainly in the 19th century, you find plenty of articles in newspapers where someone says, oh, the New York Sun is lying or whatever. The real societal distrust of the media takes off in the late 1960s primarily. And it takes off over the Vietnam War and over the idea, on the one hand, on the side of people who are opposed to the Vietnam War and are opposed to the people in government advancing the Vietnam War, the idea that they're being lied to. And of course, that really reaches a defining moment with the publishing of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, with the idea that the politicians have been lying to the American people about the Vietnam War and about what was happening in Vietnam. And of course, it was the Times who published those, but it was the sense was like the media had gone along with it on the part of people who were who were against the Vietnam War. They didn't like that. They tied a distrust of all establishment figures into that. And if I didn't articulate that well enough, we were just watching last night the documentary about Woodstock, and there's a number of people in there talking about how all the media lies, the establishment lies, politicians lie, businessmen lie. So there's this countercultural distrust of establishment figures like the media on the one hand, but that also plays into a question that somebody else has, and that is let me see if I can find it here. From Jeannie D'Amato. What happened to fervent Nixon supporters after he stepped down and the tapes came out? Proof of his guilt was no longer in dispute. And what did they say? Was there remorse, anger, or blame? And what did they say now looking back at him? Don't they see the similarities? Why don't they care? And that's the other side of distrust of the media. From the beginning, when Richard Nixon, so Richard Nixon, as you know, I'm fascinated by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is elected to office in 1968, fairly. I mean, he wins the election, but more people vote for somebody other than him than vote for him. He wins the popular vote. He wins the majority he wins more votes than anybody else does. But there are votes that go to his opponents that make up more people voting than who vote for him. And he feels this keenly. He's always worried that he does not command a majority of the American people. He's always worried about that. And of course, he has been elected on the promise that he's going to find peace with honor in Vietnam. And he doesn't have a plan for peace with honor in Vietnam. And we now know that he has scuttled talks between the Lyndon Baines Johnson's government and the North Vietnamese to go ahead and reach and achieve a ceasefire, because he's using it as a political issue. As I say, I always thought that was a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory, but now we have proof of it, so I'm wrong. It did happen. Anyway, he knows that's out there. And he knows he's desperate to end the war in Vietnam and to be able to declare it a victory. And as you may or may not remember, he launches secret bombing raids into Cambodia and went to try and cut the supply lines into North Vietnam. And when this news comes out in America, the stuff hits the fan, because people thought that the war was winding down, and they discover it's not. It's ramping up. And what he does is, with the help of his speechwriters, is he starts to say, The silent majority is on my side. And he starts to talk about the silent majority. And at first he's only talking about the people who are on his side for Vietnam, for what's happening in Vietnam, for his policies in Vietnam. And he keeps saying, you know, the majority is with me. I mean, they're not the ones in the streets, it's true. And they're not the ones who are in the newspapers, it's true. And they're not the ones you hear on the radio. But there's a majority, you just can't hear them. And he increasingly says that criticism of him is the fault of what he calls a liberal media, that they're not actually saying what's true. They are deliberately destroying him because they don't like him. And they're attacking you, the majority. Well, now, he's made that up, but it's rhetorically a very important construction. It's us, good Americans, against you, those people who are trying to tear us down. And we, good Americans, make up the majority. He's brilliant about this. It's not him. I mean, maybe it is him too, but it's really his speechwriters, especially Pat Buchanan, who's terrific at this. Pat Buchanan cut his teeth with Barry Goldwater and was always a master of the use of language and a masterful use of political polarization, quite deliberately. I mean, it's, to my mind, it's evil, but it was brilliant. Anyway, so when Nixon does that, he increasingly tries to argue that he has the majority on his side and that they are standing against, they're the silent majority standing at first against people who are criticizing the Vietnam War, but then against people that he says want a handout, that don't want to work, that want to destroy the American family. And his speeches are really specific. And you can see this if anybody is interested, and I don't expect you to be, but if you were, you could text them and you could see him saying, you could Google them and see him saying things like, they say it's old-fashioned to work for an honest day's work. There's never a they. I mean, he makes that up. It's a rhetorical construction. They say it's better to accept a handout than to build this great country. They say, there's no they. Anyway, so he sets up this construction that he is in charge of this silent majority. And then when the Watergate scandal breaks, he insists it is just the liberal media out to get him. And to the end, to his autobiography, his memoirs, he says he did nothing wrong. He simply was hounded out of office by the liberal media, who made it impossible for him to do his job, and he had to sort of magnanimously step down to let Gerald Ford do the job of being president because he could not do it because he was attacked by the media. And believe it or not, that's what people walked away with who were Nixon supporters. They walked away with the idea, not that Nixon had done anything wrong. They continued to believe he had done nothing wrong, but rather that he and the majority that he represented had been driven out of office by this liberal media that was out to get him and out to destroy the silent majority. It's really kind of astonishing. All right, so then another question, because I'm coming down to the end here. But actually, I had a couple more things I wanted to say, so I'll keep going here. A question from Jennifer Frew. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Jennifer, I'm sorry. And she said, I want to hear what the heck is, and again, I always paraphrase these. She didn't say it this way, it's the way I'm saying it. She sounded much more intelligent than I'm going to sound. She said, what's with the rise of influencers on the conservative side like Frank Luntz, who's so good at crafting language to manipulate voters, words like the death tax, for example, and Steve Bannon and so on. And on the other side, why are liberals so bad at it? Why are Democrats unable to simplify things to persuade voters? And why, when we do we do it so badly? She says, is it just that we don't think things are simple, or what's going on with that? So let me go back now here to Nixon, but to more about winning elections, because this is actually really, to my mind, interesting and really important, because I want to answer that question, which is such a great question, but I want to do that horrible thing academics say. I want to unpack it first. Because I've got a theory on this, and it's interesting to me, and that is that Forget the terms conservative and liberal altogether right now. Just forget about them. And instead, go back with me to the 1960s. Politically, you don't actually have to go back to the 1960s, although the music was pretty good. All right, so go back with me to the 1960s. And in the 1960s, coming out of the Eisenhower years of the 50s, and then the Kennedy years in the early 60s, and then we've got LBJ and the Great Society. This idea that Americans are in it together, and America's got money like nobody's business in the 1950s and the 1960s, and it shows. I mean, people are going to college, people have houses, people have cars, people have stuff, they have clothes, they have jewelry, they have, a rising standard of living across the board, even though, of course, it is not evenly spread in society. Almost invariably, it's white people who have the majority of things, but there is much more of a consciousness that America's got a lot of money and it's okay to spread it around some. And another riff I will do someday is how reform tends to take off when people feel like they've got enough money in their pockets. And this is actually a really interesting period as well, as Americans are looking at colonialism, which is breaking down really quickly in the 50s and 60s, simply because so many colonial powers can't afford to keep colonies any longer after World War II. That's a completely different rabbit hole that's fascinating. But today I'm going to stick here on the 1960s. I was just qualifying the fact I said that everybody's got money in the 60s. Of course, everybody doesn't have money in the 60s, but that GI Bill I've talked about before does a number of things. It raises a lot of people into the middle class, and that sucks a lot of people up into decent paying jobs that they would not have had before. Unions are before World War II. Unions are fairly strong. We've got this great compression in the economy where income and wealth are compressing. So there's not that big a difference between a banker and a janitor. Those of us who grew up in that era probably remember how different things felt then than they do now, for sure. So anyway, so this is the 1960s, and Americans in both political parties, I'm only going to talk about two right now, both political parties believe in the liberal consensus, the idea that the government has a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure. Both sides agree on that. They think, yeah, this is great, we're good. So there is a political theorist who rises in, he writes a seminal article in the early 60s. And what he says is, listen, we have a problem when we're trying to get people to vote for us in America right now, vote for one side or the other. He's a theorist. His name's Phil Converse. Vote for one side or the other because we all agree. Democrats and Republicans are really not divided about much of anything. I mean, they're arguing around the fringes, but they all agree on the basic liberal consensus. They both agree on this basic idea that the government has a role to play in society. So rather than trying to marshal people to the polls by convincing them that, as FDR did, that there's this new kind of government standing against this old kind that Hoover represents, rather than trying to do that and look at the struggles of the late 19th century where you have Grover Cleveland standing for the people against the plutocrats and the Republicans saying if Grover Cleveland gets elected, the entire country is going to fall apart. Rather than looking at these hugely polarizing periods where the parties really didn't look at all alike, we got the problem that the parties basically looked the same in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, of course, there's caveats to that, but that's what he wrote essentially. And mind you, this is an entire political theory course I just did in 2 minutes. So obviously it's not as nuanced as it ought to be. But he looks at this and he says, instead then of trying to come up with these grand political narratives, what you really need to do is build coalitions and say, and I'm going to be flippant here, and say that you're going to hammer together a coalition of left-handed typists from Duluth who are unhappy at the way typewriters work, to somebody in Texas who wants a new bridge, to, you're going to hammer together these coalitions by promising them little things. And you're going to go ahead and nail these coalitions together. And that's how you're going to win at a national level, is through these coalitions that are not ideological coalitions so much as bundling of goods, if you will. And I'm being flippant with that term, but that's kind of the way it looks. Well, that's just ducky. And the traditional Republicans do that. They both Republicans and Democrats start to go ahead and simply focus on bundling. But that's not what it's called. But that's, for our purposes, that's what we're going to call it. But the people who hated the liberal consensus, the people that I've been calling the movement conservatives, although they called themselves that as well, the people like William F. Buckley Jr. and the people like Barry Goldwater, who want to get rid of that liberal consensus, want to take the government back to the period before it regulated business or provided a basic social safety net or put money into infrastructure. They ignored that because they didn't want to build a coalition. They wanted to destroy this idea altogether. And from the beginning, they managed to have a really clear through line of a story. And that story was always designed not to appeal to reason, but to appeal to emotion and to take really complicated issues and reduce them to something that was very easy and very black and white. And you see this really dramatically with Goldwater's, with Goldwater in 60, but also in 64 when I'm sorry, they try and recruit Goldwater to run in 1960. He won't do it, but he comes out with the book, The Conscience of a Conservative, which is ghost written by William F. Buckley Jr.'s brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell. But then he does run in 64. And one of the things that happens when he is rising is, and when people like him are rising, is somebody goes to Eisenhower and he says, clarify things, make things, you keep trying to appeal to our brains. Stop appealing to our brains. Just tell us what to do. And Eisenhower says, no. Democracy is hard. You have to think about things. You have to reason your way through things. You have to figure out what is the best course. Well, the movement conservatives didn't want anyone to figure out what the best course was. They rejected the idea of appealing to people's brains because when you appeal to people's brains, they adhered to the liberal consensus. So from the beginning, they tell this story of a simple little guy who's being pushed aside or crushed by this big behemoth government. And you see this theme through Barry Goldwater. You see it after Barry Goldwater. You see it after, you see it with the idea that this overwhelmingly large government is going to steal your tax dollars. You certainly see it with Richard Nixon, who talks a lot about this theme. It's us hardworking little guys, the taxpayer against those people out there. And then, of course, as I always like to point out, in 1977, you get it on screen with Star Wars. The idea, this mythical idea of this little guy against the government. And in 1980, of course, Ronald Reagan rides that to the White House. And even still, you see again and again and again, movement conservatives who have now taken over the Republican Party telling a really simple story of protecting the little guy against the big government. And this was really deliberate in 1968 with Richard Nixon's campaign, when his handlers literally said, let's not appeal to reason. It's messy. It affronts people. We'll just appeal to emotion, and we'll appeal to emotion by creating a pretty picture. And that idea of movement conservatives simply getting the best words and pulling out emotion is exactly what gave rise to people like Frank Luntz, who will say to you, who's a guy who looks for the best words for movement conservatives, now Republicans, to use. He says, I'm going for emotion. I'm going for the jugular. I'm not going to try and appeal to reason. I'm not going to try and work through this. I'm just going to get votes, and I'm going to get votes by making you afraid of that, whatever that happens to be. It's actually something that's straight out of the playbook of authoritarians. And again, you know that I'm a big fan of Eric Hoffer. He talks a lot about how you can use language to determine the future. And this was a pattern to determine politics. This has been a pattern in movement conservative political activity since the 1950s. People who recognize that you could weaponize words, if you will. So why don't the Democrats push back against that? I would argue that the Democrats and the traditional Republicans both fell down on this front. And that's how both of them end up getting tossed overboard, is because both of them are appealing to reason rather than to emotion. And you see this with George H.W. Bush when he raises taxes. And he says, this is just the only responsible thing to do. And the movement conservatives led by Newt Gingrich just crush him for not, while they're appealing to emotion out there. So this is another one of the reasons that I'm fascinated by the Lincoln Project, is the Lincoln Project is appealing to emotion, and they're all Republicans who have marshaled this language in the past, but they're using it on the Democratic, to advance a Democratic candidate. And you can see the difference if you follow their stuff. You can see the difference in the way they talk than a traditional Democrat will do. And you will see that if you watch Biden or Kamala Harris or Barack Obama, they're not using that language at all. They're appealing to, if they are appealing to emotion, they are appealing to the emotion of family and reason, as opposed to go hate somebody, which is a really visceral emotion. So is love, by the way, which is something that the Democrats are starting to talk more about. All right, so then I want to go to one more thing here, and that is two things, actually. Candace Rayer asked, how did we get to the point of such wealth disparity? Well, again, if you appeal to people's emotions, a lot of people were voting for the movement conservatives based on the emotions of fear and hatred they felt for another set of people. And by putting those movement conservatives in place, what they have done is largely dismantled that liberal consensus that had compressed wealth, and instead they have gotten us back to a government that looks much more like that of the 1920s, that had this huge disparity of wealth. And you can see that really dramatically beginning in 1981 with Ronald Reagan's first tax cuts, because tax cuts sound good, but so far what they have done is they have simply shifted the burden of tax paying downward. The taxes have not gone down. What's changed is who pays them. People at the top don't pay them anymore. Now it's people in the middle, or whoever's even really left in the middle, to be honest. All right, so one more thing. What can and only one more. Actually, Tonda, I set this whole thing up to listen to get to you. And I'm going to have to put you off because I don't think I've got time to do it today. So I'll make you top of the list next week if you're listening. Sorry about that. I want to go then finally to one last thing, and that's Judy Johnson. Judy said, why should we pay any attention at all to anything Trump does if we see that not one person in authority is doing anything about it? What can one inconsequential person do? And I wanted to end with this because I love this question. What can one inconsequential person do? Nothing. But there's millions of us. So what did we do? We exposed the fact that they were gutting the United States Postal Service. And what does it matter that we pay attention and that we speak up? It matters because if you go back to where I started with this, to the idea of changing the way people think and of campaign money and of getting out messages, the way that politics works is that leaders need to reflect what they hear from their constituents, and because otherwise they're not going to get elected. And if you have a leader who is not responsive to you, they're either going to become more responsive or they're going to toss up a leader who is. And you see this really dramatically right now in the state of Maine, where Susan Collins won her last election by something like 68% of the vote. And now she's running neck and neck with Sarah Gideon, a Democrat, simply because people are looking at Collins and going, whoa, wait a minute, this is not what we voted for. You're not representing us. And she's madly scrambling because people are speaking up and they're saying, this is not okay. This is not the government I want. And as I keep on saying, the Russians and the Republicans would not be pouring the kind of money they are into having trolls hit my stupid Facebook page, if you will. I mean, the idea that they're actually investing money and trying to get you people to think that something that is not true is, like, why are they doing that? They're trying to change minds. And the way that you change minds is you speak up and you say to your, crazy uncle, you're not welcome at my dinner table if you're going to be talking that way about my African American neighbors. Or I don't want to hear about what you have to say about X. Or you say, you know what I want from a president? I want a president who's going to guarantee that workers actually have enough money coming home that they don't have to work 3 jobs. You put your voice out there in a democracy and you find other people who talk like you do, and together all your voices become something way different than inconsequential. They become a democracy. And one of the things that this moment is doing is it is reminding people, as I keep saying, that democracy is not a spectator sport, and that ultimately the people who hold power in a democracy are us. We're the ones who get to decide how the story of our democracy plays out. And it always worries me when I see so many people saying, I feel hopeless, there's nothing I can do. Well, no, you can't go on and take on, Attorney General Barr on your own. But what you can do is speak up and say it's not okay with me that that he's removing United States Attorney General. I'm sorry, U.S. attorneys, or to say it's not okay with me that Trump is doing X, or even better, this is what I want. This is what my ideal government looks like. This is what I am willing to work for. So why should we pay attention? We should pay attention to go back to where I started here, because this is what political parties are all about. It is your job as a member of a democracy to examine your leadership, not only this particular leader, but any future leaders. If you don't like what the next president is doing, you need to speak up about that as well, because it's only by voicing your own view of what you think society should look like that you can create enough pressure to make that happen. So we should be paying attention, because that's what it means to have some determination over the government under which you live. That's what it means to have a democracy that allows humans to have the right of self-determination. All right, that's me preaching, because we're in a terrible moment, but it's also a moment that is absolutely full of possibilities. And for as bad as things are, it feels to me like those possibilities are more closer within reach than they have been in a very long time. And that is exciting. All right, I'm going to let y'all go to get your supper, your dinner, your supper, whichever you call it. And I will see you on Thursday. If you would like to do history, we're moving forward in the Republican Party. This is probably close to the end, I would think. And otherwise, I'll see you back here on Tuesday. Again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these. Thank you very much for being here.